Welcome back to our study on the book of Romans. This is the Romans Education Part 5, and this is Session 7. We left off last time looking at the first part of verse 4, for he is the minister of God to thee for good. And you'll notice that this long verse is composed of a couple of sentences, and we're going to break those down. We've already talked about this first part, he's the minister of God to thee for good. We talked about those officials being ministers of God and being supposed to be beneficial for us. And then, and that is a different way, by the way, to look at those that are involved in that. Most people don't think of those guys as being that. I wanted to give you an illustration of that, and we ran out of time in the last session. When I was a young guy and I was in Louisiana, we had a church school. And I remember that there was a lot of things that were happening, and there was an association called CLA. It was Christian Law Association. There was a man who was instrumental in starting that up, and he had come into the area to solve some legal issues and things. And I remember that he said he often talked to the judges that I know most of you have either served on jury duty or something like that. In fact, I have that coming up this next week in Fort Stockton. And when the judge comes in, he's always wearing a robe, and he's sitting behind that desk with a gavel. And even though I'm not going to take the time to tell you everything he said, he would talk to those judges and he would say, do you know why you put that robe on before you come out here to listen to this? Because you are representing God in the fair and righteous judgment of these cases. And he would talk about, all of the things that were attendant for a judge. And for a lot of those guys, it was a very sobering reality to think, because to them, it's just kind of like, this is an office you run for, and then you go in and you do stuff. But really, there's something more behind that. And when he would talk about those issues, I would just be amazed, at the link between even the things still today, when you don't even think about it anymore, you're doing things that are picturing, parts of that issue. And so anyway, those are ministers of God. I mean, they really are. They're doing something with that. In fact, I'll give you a definition in a moment. In fact, we'll do it now. It's about a minister, and here it is. A minister is one who performs the will of another, an agent appointed to manage business under the authority of another. And if they're a minister of God, then guess whose authority they're operating under? They're operating under God's authority. And so, and of course, to do that thing that God created government to do. And the point that Paul is going to make here as he goes through this, and this is kind of sobering. Look, I'm all for, let's get the best person in there that we can. And I'm sorry to say this, but we've come to the place where sometimes an unbeliever does a better job of discharging an office than a believer in Jesus Christ. Now, I'm sad about that, but that's the truth of the matter. And Paul doesn't make any requirement. And so when he's talking about being a minister of God, I wanted to clarify this issue. Don't think he's saying they're functioning as a son. That's not what he's saying. When he says they're a minister of God to thee for good, he's not saying that they're laboring with God as a son. He is saying that God ordained human government, and when they fill that position, then He wants them to fulfill that purpose for the creation of human government to begin with. And when they do that, they are operating as an agent who is performing the will of God for human government, which is to control the population. That's what he's talking about. And so even in this case, an atheist can serve as a minister of God. Won't he have a surprise one day? Yeah, Clifford.
The Supreme Court, then, is actually an agent of God.
It is.
And they took God out of the court system.
They did. They've done all of that, and yet, even though they did, they are still functioning as an agent of God. They're still functioning that way. As long as those offices of governmental authority are controlling the population, that's all he's asking them to do, to be his agent, to be a minister.
And I know that it has nothing to do with the government, but if you look at the church, it's the same way. You know, God is the one that's wanting you to learn this curriculum, but yet when people go in and take the Bible, they're actually taking God out because they're doing what they want, just like with the law. You have that in every situation in life. That's
a good, yeah, because God, just like government is a divine institution, church is a divine institution, and yet, by and large, oh, I was going to tell you something. Should I say this on tape? I'll forget about it. I knew I had something else to tell you. Oh, do I dare say this on the deal? Okay. I think it's okay. It's a good thing. Every once in a while, UPS will deliver stuff out to the house. And so we've gotten to know our UPS driver. And he's a Sunday school teacher at the First Baptist Church, Midland. Well, several years ago, I gave him the book on rightly dividing the Word. And since that time, and he told me, he said, man, my kids are really, getting into this. He has grown kids. And he said, been looking at the stuff on the website, the stuff that we post for free and all of that. And he said, so he told me this week, he said, hey, I wanted to tell you, we always have these curriculums that everybody follows through the Sunday school. And he said, and right now we're in the book of Nehemiah. And he said, but in March, we're going to start the book of Romans, and we're using your curriculum to do that. I said, no kidding. He went, yeah. So I'm figuring, wow, okay. Probably up to Romans 8:14, and then the train will derail, but hey. But we'll see, Anyway, I thought, wow, that's surprisingly pleasant news, isn't it?
Would they understand that without knowing rightly dividing the Word?
We'll see. I don't know. Justification, I think they might be able to get a hold of that. Sanctification, the first two components of sanctification, I think they could get something out of that. We'll just see. We'll just see where it goes. I don't know. Anyway, I forgot to tell you about that. And I thought, wow, I can't hardly believe that. So, there it is. Anyway, so that doesn't mean you start going over to the First Baptist Church in Midland in May. By the way, you've already been through all that, so you don't want to start over. Okay. So, yeah, good review. Thank you. There's more than one troublemaker in the middle section, huh?
It might make somebody curious enough to...
You know what? You never know. That's right. You never know who might start looking at stuff and being involved. What about a field trip?
Yeah. Have him introduce you and this.
No, let's not push it. Let's not. Oh, that'd be great. Okay, so next part of the verse, Romans 13:4. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, and you understand the evil there is being defined in the context here, be afraid. Well, of course, because there's going to be consequences for those kinds of actions. And Paul has already talked about those some. Here's the next part. For he beareth not the sword in vain. In other words, that's not an empty threat. This could... There's another phrase that's going to follow here that's actually going to shed light on it. Maybe I'll just reserve my comment until I get there. The ultimate end of this, when he beareth the sword, that's capital punishment. The sword is death. Remember, we saw that back in Romans 8 when we talked about the attacks of the policy of evil, where they graduated all the way to sword, which was death. It could cost you your life. In this case, then, you understand what's being talked about, the violence of killing another person. but remember, it's an umbrella type concept. Everything below that is in play as well. Not to take your life, but to have consequences or punishment for those things that violate the law. For he beareth not the sword in vain. It's not a bluff. The word vain, Charles Smith says, fruitless, ineffectual, useless. That which is vain lacks substance, reality, solidity. And so he's saying, hey, they're not just, this is not a paper tiger. They're not just swinging a sword about they're not going to use. They really have the ability, they've been given the power to be able to utilize that. And so the next part of the verse is, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Now let's look at that word revenge. Revenge is the act of doing hurt or harm to another in return for wrong or injury suffered. Satisfaction obtained by repayment of injuries. But this word, I looked at that word and I thought, a revenger. I mean, when you look at that phrase, that government is a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. By the way, let's look at that word wrath before I make those comments. Charles Smith says, wrath is violent and continual anger accompanied by a desire to inflict punishment upon its object. And George Crabb said, wrath is a heightened sentiment of anger. Well, now, I think we all understood that it's more than just I'm angry with you. Wrath is a step up from that, and it wants to punish that. Now, when we put all of that in that phrase, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil, then here's what we're recognizing. Because it uses that term, revenger. If someone is seeking revenge, just in the common way you understand the term, what are some things you know are true about that in their thinking? I'm getting back at them. What else?
No holds barred.
No holds barred. That's good. How are they thinking about that person they're wanting to get revenge on?
They want to hurt them.
Well, they're angry and they want to hurt them. There's something they're not going to feel toward that person when the time comes. They're not going to feel compassion. There's not going to be any mercy. That's the idea that is meant to convey here, that when it says a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil, when it's a revenge type issue, this is not the issue of, well, we're just going to, we're going to show mercy this time, or we're going to, when a man kills another man, this is the core issue here. When he kills another man, they're not just going to look at that and go, well, I mean, I know there are different ways to kill people. There's murder and there's manslaughter and, and all of that. But you understand that when he says that government is a revenger to execute wrath, and you understand what wrath is about, upon him that doeth evil, that is a fearful thing. It is. And government has a real way of working that fear into your heart. I think that's part of that process, by the way.
It takes on a new meaning of just reward.
Just rewards. Yeah.
God says, vengeance is mine.
Exactly right.
And they're working for him, so there's your answer.
Right.
Yeah, it's society taking care of what should be taken care of to keep control.
Exactly. To make sure that control is exercised. And by the way, that whole system of doing things that looks like a long, drawn-out, protracted system, that whole system, that whole thing has an effect on a person. A debilitating effect on a person. And, okay, so with that, let's go to verse 5. I'm sorry, we did these definitions. Verse 5, wherefore you must needs be subject. Now, wherefore takes you back to, because of what government can do to you, you should be subject. Because they have the power to do that. But now he's going to introduce a second reason to be subject to the higher powers. Take a look at this next part. Not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. What is your conscience?
That little voice that says good or bad.
Oh, it is. That's a really good way to say it. It's that little voice in you, that instant... What is all that? I'm falling apart. I need to tighten the screws in this or something. What?
I think it's a red shirt.
You think it's...
Yeah.
Okay. There's something going on here. Okay.
Conscience.
Okay. What were we talking about?
Sorry, Mike.
Something about your time.
No, before that. Conscience.
Balance. Yeah.
It's that little voice that instantly tells you that what you're hearing is right or wrong, it's good or bad. It's that little part of you, right? I hate standing like this. Yeah, okay.
You're on the other.
But is your conscience always a good guide? Sometimes it's not. Remember those old bumper stickers that used to say, "Let your conscience be your guide," and they'd X out conscience and they wrote in Bible. Remember when they had those bumper stickers? Okay. Look, when Paul was saying this, he's not talking about because your conscience, when how does it determine what's right and wrong? How does it do that? Well, no, let's just say anybody in general. Anybody out there, past experience, what else? Yeah, what they've learned, right, has put a certain view in their mind. And they consider these things to be right, and they consider these things to be wrong, right? In other words, that's something that's got built up in them. But remember the context here. Your Father is instructing sons in justice. So what is He doing here? He is saying, look, I'm going to paraphrase this. We're going to come back and look at it. Because of what government can do to you, be subject unto the higher powers. Because they really do have the power to put consequences on you if you don't. But then he comes along and says, but you must needs be subject not only for wrath, but there's a higher purpose for being subject. And it's not just so I don't get punished by the government. Because now he's counting on the fact that you know something. And that's going to be in your conscience. The fact that you know who created human government, and you know why God created human government, and you know that without that human government, there would be no order to this at all. It would all be total violence and chaos, and we wouldn't have any semblance of the kind of life that we enjoy now. And because government does that one thing, he is saying that is enough for you to decide not just to keep from being punished by them, but because you understand what I have done in creating it and what I'm continually doing every day that government works is I'm controlling the citizens under that government. Because that's in your conscience, that now needs to be the motivation for being subject. Because that means you understand what it is I'm doing. I was going to try to illustrate this. I didn't come up with a really good way to do this. So just right off the cuff, let me see if I can't come up with an analogy. Because I believe that God is not in the business of injecting Himself into the physical circumstances of our life in order to bring certain things to pass. If I act like that and talk like that and pray like that, here's what I know would be happening to me. I would be making the adversary well pleased. because I am demonstrating my lack of understanding of this issue of what God is and is not doing. Secondly, I'd be praying out of the will of God. If I misunderstood, you understand what I'm saying? If I did this the old way, I'd be doing all of those things that really didn't bring any credit to what God was doing. I would be discredit what God is doing. The same thing is true here. I think this is what Paul is saying. Okay, look, I got a better way to illustrate it. Forget that illustration. Wipe that out. The jury will disregard those last comments. Here it is. Do you want your kids to do what you want them to do because they know they're going to get in trouble if they don't? Or do you want them to do it because there's a relationship with you and they understand that you want what's best for them? Which would you rather?
The latter.
So you'd rather the latter, wouldn't you? You'd rather them do what they do out of an understanding. See, if someone says, hey, my friends asked me to do such and such, and I told them, no way, I am not going to do that with them. And if you say, why? If they go, well, because I knew we'd get caught and then we'd get in trouble. Okay, at least that kept them from doing it. But listen, if you're looking at this verse and you're looking at the previous verse about wrath, can't a lost person subject themselves to government to keep from incurring government's wrath? Even a lost person can do that. Now he's given you a reason for a son. And but if you say to your kid, why didn't you do it? And they go, because our family name means something and I'm not going to lower it in that. How do you feel about that? See, you're going, yes! Yes, this is great. This is where I wanted it to get. Here's your father's yes. Yes, government has the power. I've given it the power to do this. And because of wrath's sake, you can be subject. But I want you, as my sons, to be more than that. I want you to do this for conscience sake. In other words, you realize what it is I am doing. And in support of that, that becomes the reason now. Does that make sense to you? Do you see what I'm saying with this? So now he's given us a second reason, and I think this one takes us way beyond what just avoiding the wrath is. Because this is a higher motive. This is a higher purpose that we're answering to. Let me give you the Webster's 1828 definition for conscience. The internal judgment of right and wrong, the faculty, power, or principle within us which decides on the lawfulness or unlawfulness of our own actions and affections and instantly approves or condemns them. Karen shortened that up very well for us and said exactly what the core of that is. And we know what that is. But you know, here's the point I want to make by giving you this definition. We're supposed to get to the place where this doctrine has worked in us effectually, and our response to the government doesn't stem out of what government can do to us. It stems out of what our Father is doing with government.
Once again, that proper response.
It is. It's the proper response. It's the way to say, I'm going to do this because I know He's the one that instituted it. He's the one that gave it the power to do what it's doing. And in spite of everything else it does or doesn't do, if it does this one thing, it has served its purpose. And once we operate out of that knowledge, that is what it is to do it from conscience sake. That we instantly know what is right and wrong based on that education. Okay, let's do a review here and just see where we are so far. First of all, rulers are not a terror to those who live a quiet and peaceable life in obedience to the law of the land, not the law of Moses. Rulers are meant to be a terror to the lawlessness of men, especially to violent offenders. Because of what government can do, we ought to be afraid to resist the power. I mean, it's not saying don't be. Of course you are. If we subject ourselves, we'll be looked upon by government with favor. Rulers are ministers of God with regard to what God ordained government to do, no matter who they are. Because God's not interested in the who, He's interested in the what. That's what government does. And it doesn't matter who is in charge. Rulers are meant to discharge their office to our benefit. Rulers are meant to be punishers of those who break the laws of order and control, especially those that are violent. Government has the power to punish and even take a man's life for his crimes. Therefore, we subject ourselves for wrath's sake. We also subject ourselves for conscience sake because we are sons. Any questions about what we've covered so far? I know this is a lot briefer than the way we used to cover material, but as I told you some months back, Romans, I think, is the outline that gets all of this, and we're just being introduced to it, and so I'm just covering it just that way. So, okay, all right. So now, with that under our belt, there's something else that I want us to take a look at here. By the way, if you have the idea that because you are saved and because you are a son who's involved in the education, that you can somehow violate the laws of government and God will intervene to deliver you, you are mistaken. And do you know what that tells you? Do you know what that tells you? Huh? It tells you what?
God's in control.
God's in control. What did you say, Clifford?
You haven't learned enough.
You haven't learned enough. Yeah, that's true. Both of those are true.
But as a son, we know that death is also a blessing. We're still fighting for His will.
Well, you know what? If the policy of evil kills you, you know, that was a glorious way to go. If you died because, you know what, you were a murderer, not so glorious.
Yeah.
But here's the point I am going to get to. God is so concerned. Let me ask you a question. Here's God up in heaven, and here's a guy that has, let's say he has a television ministry that has gone all over the world, and millions of people are being impacted by his ministry. And let's say that this guy is responsible for people getting saved and people getting introduced to the Word of God. If he goes on a killing spree, will God intervene on his behalf? No, He will not. And here's what that tells you. It is more important to God for government to do what it does in controlling the violence of men than it is for that man's ministry to be successful. Do you see what I'm saying? God is saying, if I have to choose between government continuing to control or you having a big ministry, I'm going to take the governmental control because even you are going to be subject to that if you violate it. And I'm not going to intervene on your behalf. Do you see what I'm saying? So that puts a perspective on it. At least that really impacts me to think that no matter how much good you may be doing in the world, it is more important to your Father to keep the policy of evil at bay through the use of governmental control than it is for you to have a successful ministry. And I would think that even if you were teaching sonship, you would understand that to God it is more important for this not... And you know what? I see these kinds of things all the time. Sometimes at night, Billy and I stream Netflix, and we have watched this old detective series. It was a guy in England, and it was back, you know, during the war, and they were bombing London at the time, and what was happening is he was still a I say a homicide detective. He's a DCI, the English deal. But anyway, he catches a guy who's been committing these murders, and he's gonna, you know, they finally catch him, and then guys from the government show up, or from the military rather, show up. Well, that's part of the government, and they take him away because he is critically needed to break this code or to devise this thing that's going to help England survive and win this war. And so he's outraged because this man needs to be brought to justice for his crimes. And his problem was, you guys are willing to overlook the crime because he served a necessary purpose. The principle I'm showing you, I'm not trying to say that the TV program should open up the debate, but what I'm saying is, to your Heavenly Father, He would rather have control, governmental control, to keep that kind of violence from happening than He would for the other good that that individual might produce. Because sometimes we get to weighing those out. I'm just putting this in your thinking because that's the way your Father thinks about it. He realizes if governmental control in this world goes away, this world goes away.
Well, God allowed the lions to eat the Christians.
He sure did. He allowed the lions to eat the Christians. He did.
Happen again with another religion trying to hurt us.
Well, you know what? And there's nothing to say, nothing in your Bible that says those hard days may not come.
Right.
And I'm going to tell you that no matter what happens then, your Father has not left us with nothing. He has left us with an all-sufficient grace that is able to give us the patient endurance of everything that we will encounter. You know, we've been through all that. I'm just trying to put it in a sentence. But my point is, right now, it's pretty easy. We're not paying any price for being believers.
Right.
That may change. And it may change in our lifetime. It may not. But I'll guarantee you one thing, sonship is the thing that you're going to need in all its components to be able to go through those things. And whether we go through them or not here, we're certainly going to need them when we get to the heavenly places. Okay, let's get to this next part. So here's where we are in verse 6. For this cause pay you, what have I got left here? Oh, for this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. So when he says tribute, he is talking about taxes. And here's, again, they are God's ministers. He's emphasizing that again. And the fact that they attend continually upon that very thing means government's always doing its thing. This very thing, remember I told you it does one thing. And that's the thing government is always doing. And it may not do the right things, but it always controls. And that's what God is after in that. Okay, now look at verse 6 again. For this cause pay you tribute. You know what? I had a tribute, I was supposed to define it in here, and it wasn't on the PowerPoint. But that's a forced tax upon citizens of a state. And so, so Paul nowhere tells us not to do that. But they are God's ministers attending continually upon this one issue of controlling its population. That's what's being talked about there. Verse 7, render therefore to all their dues. What are dues? If something is due you, what does that mean? Okay, it's owed, right? All right. This is broken. There's four things here. Tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Those are broken down into two parts. The first part here, that we're going to see them broken down into two parts with two in each part. The first one is, it says, tribute to whom tribute, and custom to whom custom. And that is monetary payment that is given to the government in different forms. Those are broad terms, and a whole lot of things fit under those. Because if it's a forced tax, it's a tribute. If it's on goods and services and things like that, that's a custom. I mean, and so let me give you an example. Your income tax is a tribute. Your sales tax is a custom. It's just, and what he's saying is, it doesn't really matter what the tax is or what it covers. you give what you're supposed to give. Now Jesus, remember, paid taxes himself. He took the coin from the fish's mouth, and what did he say to Peter when he gave it to him?
Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's.
Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what's God's. And those things aren't the same. So there's no conflict there. And so he says, and by the way, wasn't that the government that put him to death? You see, he's not given an exception here. Okay, so tribute and custom are those taxes. I think you get that. Now, the second one is in the main, because that's what this is under. This is under the broad heading of all kinds of taxes. The second two are under the broad heading of respect, fear, and honor. And those are the opposite extremes of things. If you're talking about fear, it means you're doing it because, you're afraid not to. But on the other end of the spectrum is honor. And let me give you that definition for honor because I have it here. Well, I'm going through these things. Honor is the respect given to something or someone of worth, high regard and respect for one's station, position, or office. Now, I have one last long verse to show you in the book of Acts. And I want to show you Paul's attitude toward this. I started to give you another one. I knew this lesson was already going to be long, and so I didn't give you the second one. We may look at it again later sometime. But look, this is, by the way, I'm going to give you a verse before I get there. I was reminded when he talked about honor to whom honor. Remember when Paul quotes this? Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise. He's referring back to that. When you honor your father and mother, that's an issue of respect, isn't it? Did it say as long as they're really good parents?
No.
Because it's not about the person. What is it about? It's the position. In other words, if they hold that office, it is worthy of a certain honor, regardless of who holds that office. Now, I know that that's a hard thing to get, depending on if you happen to like the people in office or don't like the people in office, but your father's saying, I'm not looking at the people come and go. It's the office I'm looking at. In the military, when they'd see an officer and they didn't like him, and the guy was a bum and a jerk, and guys would say, I don't want to salute him. And someone would remind them, you're not saluting the man, you're saluting the uniform. Because that rank means something. That's what he's talking about here when he's talking about honor to whom honor. You don't get sidetracked with the person, but look at the position. And that position requires that there's some honor with regard to that. Now, let me read this to you out of the book of Acts. Acts 25, verse 1. Now when Festus was come into the province after 3 days, he ascended from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Then the high priest and the chief of the Jews informed him against Paul. In other words, they came and complained about Paul and besought him and desired favor against him, that he would send for him to Jerusalem, lying wait in the way to kill him. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself would depart shortly thither. Let them therefore, said he, which among you are able, go down with me and accuse this man if there be any wickedness in him. You understand what's happening here? These guys have laid a trap for Paul, and they want him to send Paul to Jerusalem. They're going to lie in wait, they're going to kill Paul, and they're just wanting him to cooperate with the process. He won't do that. He says, no, if you want to go with me there, and he's going to stay in Caesarea, you can come down, we'll see if there's any wickedness in this man. Verse 6, and when he had tarried among them more than 10 days, he went down unto Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, commanded Paul to be brought. And when he was come, the Jews which came down from Jerusalem stood round about, and laid many and grievous complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. While he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, neither against the temple, nor yet against Caesar, have I offended anything at all. This is Paul talking. But Festus, willing to do the Jews a pleasure, answered Paul and said, Wilt thou go up to Jerusalem and there be judged of these things before me? Then Paul said, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. To the Jews have I done no wrong, as thou very well knowest. Look at this next statement, because Paul's whole defense is, I'm not a lawbreaker. For if I be an offender or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. Do you see what he's saying? If I'm found guilty of something that's worthy of death, I insist you kill me. So Paul is looking at this exactly the way we've been looking at this in Romans 13. Because he says, But if there be none of those things whereof these accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. I appeal unto Caesar. Which means now he's on his way to Rome, because he's appealed to Caesar. The interesting part of this, and there's a lot we could talk about here, is that when Paul says this, he is giving credence to the fact that government, he's not exempt from that. He doesn't expect to be. In fact, he says, if I've done something worthy of death, I'll cooperate with the government. I don't know if you remember in Texas, I don't remember this gal's name, but in Texas years ago, and I think Bush was, I don't know if he must have been the president then. She had one of those southern names, Tammy Faye something, I don't remember.
Madeline O'Hare?
No, this is a gal that was, she had committed murder and she was in prison and she had been found guilty. She was vile. While she was awaiting her execution, she got saved. Truly saved. Gosh, what was that girl's name? It was here in Texas. Do you remember what I'm talking about? This girl, I mean, she really, really got saved. And so they wanted to mount this, that she is so changed that surely, an appeal to see if she wouldn't be put to death. You know what? She never, I don't know that she knew this, but she never got involved in that. Her outlook was, I did this and I deserve the punishment for it. Now I got to tell you, when it's your neck on the line, that's quite a statement to make. And here is Paul saying, if I'm found worthy of anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. I insist on dying. That's the kind of attitude that was with Paul. Now, Paul's not looking to check out, because he comes along after that and says, but if not, then I don't need to go anywhere toward Jerusalem. I'll appeal to Caesar. And that's the point that that's one of the points that we've been making in all of this. All right, now I know that we haven't spent a lot of time with it, and we went through the verses here, the last ones, pretty quickly, but really, we've seen what they are. We've seen what those are saying to us. That's the kind of thinking that has to start getting generated in your thinking right now. As we progress through the curriculum, we're going to come back to these issues, and we're going to build on these issues, and we're going to get further instructed about this. Now, you got to understand, out of all the Sonship curriculum, this is the hardest part to teach for me, because I know this is not the popular way to look at it. But I'm telling you that if we're going to be sons and daughters that are actually going to function properly up there, we better get this into our heads and into our conduct and behavior, because we're going to be called on to labor with our Father out of this. And so, just to say it at the end, this is working. This is another thing that is working to conform us to the image of God's Son. And we've got to get that happening. And so I've already decided, as many of you are here, probably everyone here, or you wouldn't still be coming, I don't have any sacred cows that are worth more to me than the truth of the Scripture. I have always been corrected by the Scripture. I'm not trying to find a loophole or a way out. If it says it, That's it. Clifford made a good statement last week when we were talking after the session, and he said, look, if Paul says it, that's just it. Do you remember saying that? When you said, if Paul said it, that's just it.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's got to be the attitude, doesn't it? If you're really going to get this. Because it's not a cafeteria where we pick and choose things, leave some on the serving table and take others on our plate. You know, we get it all if we're going to be the sons that we're intended to be. Okay, let's have prayer and we'll be done. Father, thank you for your goodness to us. All the goodness that you have given us in your Son, Jesus Christ, the goodness that you have bestowed upon us in this dispensation of grace, your goodness which has made available to us a written revelation of Scripture, of truth. Thank you, Lord, for the part that you allow us to play in what it is that you're doing. There's a dozen things that would oppose an area of our sonship like this. I pray they would not be successful, but that as your sons and daughters, we would be fiercely loyal to the doctrine and count on that doctrine to do its effectual work in us so it transforms us, that we really do become what that doctrine expects of us. That it's not something that we have to force ourselves to do, but that as that doctrine works, it really does make us into that. And we